We will now learn about the default constructor and how it behaves in the presence of a parameterized constructor. So what is the default constructor? When no constructor is defined in a class, a default constructor is added. So we had seen it earlier when we had created the class student. We had given no constructor. So a default constructor had been added. Why was it added? Because no constructor was defined. If there is a parameterized constructor in a class, does the class have a constructor? Yes. And which is why then no default constructor is added. So if a class has a parameterized constructor, then no default constructor is added. Let's look at some examples to understand it better. So here we have this class student which we had declared earlier, and here we are saying student st1 is equal to new student. So this is perfectly fine. Why? Because here in this class, do we have a constructor that we have defined? No. Because we have not defined a constructor, a default constructor is added, and a default constructor is always without parameters. So a default constructor is added in this case. And how does the default constructor look like? It will be student. It does not take parameters. So which is why when we say student st1 is equal to new student, it will find the default constructor. So that is how it will work. Now suppose, what does the default constructor do? Let's try and understand that. So here, after creating the object with the default constructor, what are we saying? We are saying system.out.println st1.name. So what happens in this case is when an object is created, all its fields are initialized to default values. So default values would be, for a string the default value is a null, and for an int the default value is 0. So this happens when an object is created. So irrespective of whether we have a constructor or not, all the values will get initialized to the default values. So now when we say st1, what will st1 look like? st1 in this case, after we have created it, would be name will be null because it's the default value, and age is 0. So this is how it will look like. So now when we say system.out.println st1.name, what will get printed is null. And then when we say system.out.println st1.age, what will get printed is 0. So these are the default values it takes. So a string is always initialized to null. Null means there is no object there. It's a special keyword meaning nothing. And ints are always, or integers are always initialized to 0. So now here we have another variation of the class student. So this is the class student and we have a constructor here. Now what kind of a constructor do we have? We have a parameterized constructor because this constructor is taking 2 parameters. Now what are we saying here in our code? We are saying student st1 is equal to new student. Is this constructor taking parameters? No. So now when I call this new student, will it call this constructor? It cannot call this constructor because this took 2 parameters. This is not taking a parameter. So in this case, it will not find this constructor. Also note, as we had discussed, in this case, no default constructor will be defined. Why? Because this class has a constructor. So here we will get a compile error. So when we are compiling this code, we will get a compile error and it will say no such constructor found. So it could not find such a constructor that we are calling here. So hence it will give us a compile error. In this case, how would we run it? Suppose we had said student st1 is equal to new student John, 26, the code we had already studied earlier. So this would have worked fine because this would have called this constructor because the parameters are matching. It's taking a string and an int, which is a string and an int. So this matches, and hence it would create a student st1 and that student would have name is equal to John and age is equal to 26 as we have studied. And now when we print it, what will happen? st1.name is John and age is 26. So this will get printed on the screen. Let's look at one more example. So here we have this example of the rectangle and the constructor. Is this a parameterized constructor? Yes, this is a parameterized constructor, and we're doing certain activities within this constructor. Now suppose we are saying rectangle rect1 is equal to new rectangle. Is this constructor called taking parameters? No. So what will happen in this case? Will it find such a constructor? The constructor we have defined has two parameters. So obviously this won't match this constructor. And would a default constructor be added in this case? No. Why? Because if a parameterized constructor is present, then no default constructor is added. Hence, when we try and compile this code, we will get an error. And what is the error we will get? No such constructor was found. So we will get this compile error. So this would be the compile error we would get in this case. So how do we take care of that compile error? So suppose this class had no constructor, like in this case. Now what will happen in this case? In this case, because we have not defined a constructor, what will get added is a default constructor, which means now there is no problem here. Once we call this constructor, what will happen? To rect1, all its fields will get initialized to default value. So what will length be? Int we know is defaulted to 0, the default value is 0. So length will get the value 0 and breadth will get the value 0. So these are the default values. So now when we print rect1.length, what will get printed is 0. And when we print rect1.breadth, what will be printed is 0. So this will be the output in this case.